Welcome, everybody, to Hot Science at Home. We're so glad you can make it tonight. The Environmental Science Institute at the University of Texas is excited to bring you the latest and coolest advancements in science through Hot Science at Home. Please join me in welcoming Professor Isabel Montañez, our special guest for this evening. Welcome, Dr. Montañez. How are you tonight?
I'm great, Jay. How are you?
I'm a glow, apparently. Yes.
You are.
So let me tell you a little bit about Isabel. She's a field geologist and a geochemist specializing in studies of ancient climate change. She's a University of California, Davis Distinguished Professor, Director of the Muir Institute of the Environment, and she was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2021. For those of you not familiar with the National Academy of Sciences, it's kind of like the Hall of Fame scientists, the elite of the elite. So pretty awesome. I remember first meeting Isabel at a conference in 1985 when we were both nerdy geology graduate students. And here we are, Isabel, closing in on 40 years of knowing each other. So awesome to have you here with us tonight. So you're a paleoclimatologist, which means you studied climate change that happened thousands to millions of years ago. Well, why should we worry about what happened so long ago in the past?
Well, the simple answer is that the past informs the future. So today, we're in a severe drought. I think everybody knows that. Conditions that pretty much throughout the U.S. Southwest and even including into Texas. And so you're looking here at a map of the U.S. and it's showing in colors the intensity of drought. So anywhere that is dark reds or brown, that's exceptional drought. This is from last August and 21. And this drought has pretty much been going on for 20 years. Yeah, there have been some years that are wetter, but basically this is a 20-year-old drought and it is anticipated to continue. So to answer your question, the best way to learn about what this will come to in the future is to study what happened in the past. I can say with regard to the current drought, similar conditions, similar intensity of drought occurred over 1,000 years ago at a time we call the Middle Ages or the medieval climactic warming. And, you might ask, how do we know this? And there's many different ways we know that this drought was equivalent in intensity to today. But some of the coolest ways, for instance, is you see standing trees drowned by tens of feet in lakes and rivers all through California. And these date back to the Middle Ages. And so what they're recording is these mega droughts that were superimposed over a couple hundred years of time. And basically, they were associated with a warming throughout Northern Hemisphere. So if the past informs the future, then it would suggest that we would anticipate increasing drought conditions with continued warming.
So it really is critical that we understand what's happened in the past, and these trees are one way of figuring this out. What about, before we had thermometers, rain gauges, we go back 1,000 years, tens of thousands of years. How can we figure it out now that we realize how important this is?
Yeah, good question. So, paleoclimatologists have a lot of different tools or archives for how past climate changed. And I imagine some of the listeners tonight have heard about ice cores and tree rings. But caves are also an archive of past climate, including rainfall and drought.
Really? So caves can tell us about past climate. I knew I was wearing this for some reason.
I just thought you were in the dark tonight.
I'm just feeling a little too dorky. So tell us about how caves can tell us this.
Yeah, so let's look at this diagram, and it will explain why these caves are archives of climate. The rain falls onto the surface, onto the ground, and it infiltrates the soils. It goes through the rock, through cracks. It uses cracks to its advantage, and then it ultimately hits the cave. That's the brown part in this diagram. And you can see little drips of water that are dropping from the cave ceiling, and we call that drip water. And the cool thing is that mineral formations form from these drip waters, and we call these stalagmites. And you can see one here, this tall tower-like or cone-like formation that forms on the floor of these caves. And they form in layers, very much like tree rings.
Yeah, cool. I happen to have a stalagmite here. If we walked into a cave, there's a mite. It might make it to the ceiling someday. The water drips on it, spreads out, and an incremental layer of calcite grows. And if you've never seen one of these sliced open and polished, you could see, as Isabel was talking about, we have these lines, much like lines in trees, much like the rings in trees that can tell us time and apparently other clues.
That's right. And I like to think of them as a forensic tool, kind of like a detective's tool, because as they grow, these mineral deposits grow, they capture signals of what's going on in terms of the drip water in the cave, the conditions in the cave, and also what's happening above the cave, like rainfall behavior and temperature.
Hmm. So your research takes you into caves. What's involved with that?
Aha, yeah. Well, one drops usually into a cave on a rope, and usually in the dark. And you had on the helmet showing us the light you might have that you can turn on. And then that's followed by trying to fit in and squeeze through these tight, narrow passages until you get to those nice big cave chambers where those mineral deposits or stalagmites that we want to study are growing.
Yeah, right on. I knew I was wearing the helmet for a reason. I was living vicariously now that I'm watching you descend into the deep there. So, as I understand that your research is showing, you're actually finding and analyzing water that was trapped thousands of years ago in these mineral deposits, these stalagmites. Is that right? How does that work?
Yeah, that's right. And it's super cool. Um, so let's look at the next slide. We're gonna look at literally a CT scan of a stalagmite. And this is a stalagmite that came from a cave in the foothills of the central part of the Sierra Nevada in California. And there's caves all through the Sierra, and this is just one of them. But what you're looking at here is a CT scan, just like you might envision one from a human body or from a pet, who gets a scan to see what's wrong. So CT scanning and other kinds of scanning let us actually look inside of the stalagmite. So what are you looking at here? It lets us actually look at these little holes or cavities in the stalagmite, and they are all through there. And if you squint and you can see these darker areas, the really dark gray, those are cavities or holes. And if they're dark gray, they're air-filled. But if they're green, like those blebs at the top, or those layers that are stacked on top of each other at the bottom, that's because they're filled with water. And that's fossil drip water. Yep.
Wow, that is really something. I mean, this to me conjures up an image from Jurassic Park of the ancient mosquito from the Jurassic trapped in amber. Yeah. And from, the scientists sticking the syringe in there and extracting the blood from the mosquito that had the dinosaur blood, and the dinosaur DNA was extracted, and then all hell broke loose. And eight movies later, we still don't have it figured out. But analogously, your trapped water is analogous to the mosquito. Yeah. And if so, then what's the DNA equivalent in your stalagmites?
Yeah. Well, now you're making me feel badly. I don't have a mosquito in there to pull out the blood. But I guess for the equivalent of the DNA of a fossil mosquito for a stalagmite would be the ability to measure the isotopes of that trapped water or the fossil water.
Aha, isotopes. Very interesting chemical species that maybe can tell us a lot about a lot that's happened in the past. So can you share with us the kind of information that the isotopes reveal for you?
Yeah, so let's share first with the audience that water is made up of two atoms, hydrogen and oxygen, and each of those atoms or elements has a unique isotopic signature, kind of like a fingerprint that lets us say something about those conditions inside and outside the cave. So I'll show you a plot next, and I'm going to walk you through this because I know plots can be kind of boring at times, but they're rich with information. So here you're looking on the horizontal axis as the oxygen isotopes of waters, and then on the vertical axis, hydrogen isotopes. And the reason we make these plots of these unique signatures of hydrogen and oxygen and plot them this way is because it lets us define things like the meteoric water line. That's the black line on this plot.
Hmm.
Anywhere you go in the world, if you take the rainwater and you made a plot like this, it'll define that black line. So on this black line, you see a lot of gray points and you see some black boxes. And those are rainfall from the regions around this cave, that in this particular cave we're studying. And the white boxes are the drip water, the modern drip water from that cave. And then the colored symbols are the isotopes of that fossil water.
Uh-huh.
And they range from 20,000 years old, when we last came out of the last ice age, to 10,000 years ago. And during this 10,000 years period time, the conditions in most of the US were warming. So you can think of it as that a record of gradual warming. But here's the cool thing. If you squint and you look, there's actually quite a few blue circles on there, different colors of blue.
Hmm.
And you don't see them real well because they cluster in the middle there. And
Hmm.
they're not that far off from the modern drip water. And those are from cool times. And then the symbols that are warm colors of yellow, orange, and red, those are from the warm times, superimposed on that overall warming. And you can see they define a much broader range. And they actually define that dashed line. That's an evaporation trend. So what that's telling us then is that when it was warmer, the waters were being evaporated more, and then when it was the cooler times. So warmer times, drier conditions.
Hmm. Wow. Let me see if I have this right. So your team's figuring out that during those warming periods, as we came out of the last ice age and there was a global warming and the atmosphere was warming up, and it wasn't human driven climate change, right? This is a natural baseline of climate change. As we're warming up, ice age is ending, the rainwater during those periods was more evaporated than today. Do I have that approximately right?
Yep. Certainly, it suggests that in the cave, that drip water was more evaporated, and it probably means that the rainwater, as it was evaporating, we call it subcloud, because it was warmer and drier.
Hmm.
And yeah,
Okay.
so it does suggest that warming comes with drying, right? In the past, and we started out this conversation by looking at the map of drought conditions, and we saw that a little earlier, right? Darker
Mhm.
colors are exceptional drought. So what we're seeing today is certainly that warmer conditions seem to go hand in hand with drier conditions, just like what we're seeing 20,000 to 10,000 years ago when it was warmer. And there's two reasons why we're seeing that today, and likely why we saw it back then. A warmer atmosphere is thirstier. It has a greater demand to evaporate surface water. We call it evaporative demand. And the second reason is that atmospheric circulation patterns that bring us our rains, they change when there's warming in the atmosphere. So it's a pretty good bet that in the past it's warming, and these two things change similarly to what they are doing today.
Hmm. Wow. And so what does this also portend as we go into the future? You're talking about the medieval warm period and the mega droughts plus 10, 20, 30-year longer droughts. What how does this information help ground us? What's happened in the past, what's happening today in terms of these climate models and what they're projecting
Right?
for later in the 21st century?
So certainly the climate models, climate models there's always some dispute between different models, but they generally show it drying for the American West, including in Texas. And it makes sense. A warmer atmosphere wants to draw, evaporate more water from the ground and water bodies. And they also show those changes in rainfall patterns that are pretty much in line with what we're already seeing, certainly in California, and in the American West. But I think what's kind of notable is that this past year made the news quite a bit because this drought in California, in Arizona, Nevada, in particular, it vied as the driest or most intense period other than 1,200 years ago. So basically, the drought of the last year was the worst since the Middle Ages. And if this trend continues, which there's no evidence that it won't, then next year could bust that record, meaning that those droughts of the Middle Ages with warming will not have been as intense as what we'll maybe see in the coming year and future.
Wow, that's pretty sobering. What are some of the other clues that your group is finding, and maybe other groups in these cave deposits? Like, today, one of the big impacts we're seeing, I think it's even happening this week, are these just really destructive wildfires happening in many of these arid parts of the world that are now more arid than normal.
Right.
Are you able to actually find clues from past wildfires?
So yes, we think, it's really novel, sort of experimental work, but, and I think the Australians have managed to show some nice promising data for their caves. But yeah, so what we see are these biologic molecules. They're literally molecules of fire products. When the trees and grasses burn, they leave these oils essentially, and other kinds of molecules that are biogenic. They're biomolecules, and they're big, and they don't break down easily. And so when that rain falls on top of the cave, it infiltrates the soil, it infiltrates through the cave and then into the drip water, and they're preserved. And it's looking like these fire molecules can last for up to even 100,000 years.
Hmm.
They're entombed in the stalagmites, probably in those fossil waters. And here's what we're really excited about. There's a couple of those molecules that look like they might just relate or scale to intensity of the fires. So,
Really?
yeah, it's still the verdict is still out because it's pretty new science, but it's looking like that, yes, they will. And I can say one other thing. This is actually somebody else's work that I collaborate with, but they're seeing really high fire indicators in times where in the past the rainfall patterns were really wacky, up and very dry, very wet, very dry, very wet, on the couple year kind of scale over several decades or even a century. And the climate modelers call this whiplash climate because we're whiplashing from, wet to dry, wet to dry. And that's what's predicted for our future, at least in California, with warming. That's what the climate models tell us. And it's interesting that the fossil fire or past fire indicators are screaming upward when you see that whiplash climate in the past.
Fascinating. So you have biological molecules as markers of this past activity. So it's almost getting to DNA
Yeah.
from the mosquito and the amber. It's really trending that way. That's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, thanks so much. We have questions in the from our audience, and first question we have comes from Rocklist, and what Rocklist asks is: water trapped as drops macro, or are they very tiny amounts? How is the preparation for the isotope dating?
Okay, well, I'm going to call you Rocklist because I don't have another name. So to give credit, it's always the real protagonists in any faculty members' lab is, of course, always the fantastic students that do the work. And I had this amazing PhD student. I call her Babs. You'll see her recognized at the end. And so she worked very hard to get these trapped waters. But to answer your question specifically, if you remember that CT scan of the stalagmite, some of those were blebs. I mean, little blobs of green. And I think we saw some that were certainly millimeter scale and maybe even a centimeter scale that are filled with water. So that's unusual. Most of these waters get trapped when crystals grow, and they tend to grow vertically because they grow, fairly fast. When the crystals are growing vertically, they're little bits of blebs or water, literally microliters, and then the crystals close and they trap that water. So most of those green bands, that's where you're seeing the water. It's between each of those crystals. And so you see these whole green bands. And we don't actually date those waters. We get their isotopes for more of a character, right? More of a what happened, what was the rain, where was it coming from, how much did it rain?
Right. So analytically, you need just fractions of microliters to be able to measure the isotope composition. For the isotope dating, that involves usually a lot more material. But you're independently measuring the age using isotope dating of the calcite growth layer, if I understand it right, that the droplets are trapped in.
That's right. So we basically carve out the layers that we know were dated precisely so that we're precisely getting the water from those layers.
Right on. Yeah. So Rock has another question. I feel familiar with him, so I'm going to call him Rock now. His other question is, are these caves in Native American land? And if so, do you partner with the tribes?
That's a great question. They are, well, I was going to say they are not, but actually I suspect for California, that's probably any land is in fact undoubtedly probably going to be associated with some peoples and some tribes. I don't know of that specifically. These are all either on private lands, and that doesn't mean a thing, right? Or in national parks or state forests, like a state demonstration forest. But the answer is absolutely they are. And no, we're not partnering with tribes. We should be. And I thank you for bringing that up because I'm sure there are opportunities.
Yeah. So, Isabel, where do you see sort of this field heading of reconstructing like the past tens of thousands of years of climate? We have models that can go forward and project future climate. Is there a collective effort that you see that's combining the efforts to model, the efforts to reconstruct what's happened in the past to produce sort of an overall better picture of what we might anticipate for climate change in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think the future is in the integration of the observations, or the data and the models. The data and the models have their strengths and they have their uncertainties, right? And I think the community, not just this community, but others that work in the oceans and that work on clouds, for example, they're actually trying to do this by very sophisticated statistical methods, right? That allow you to take data, model, at the same time be modeling these conditions, these environments, the cave, for instance, and then you literally iteratively run these things, on supercomputers, because there's tens to hundreds of thousands of runs until that you see the convergence, the best fit of the data and the model to the data. And it takes big collections of data. So it's one way to look at, I think the future is going to be not individual caves, but entire sets of caves, right? Where we can do these kinds of efforts. And it'll better give us a sense of, it'll filter out the noise. I think we need to filter out the noise because caves are noisy, right? I mean, you know that as well as I do. And so an ability to do that, to get at the real signal that seems to be coming out of all of these records would be ideal. And that might be the way to go forward.
Oh, right on. Um, so Steve asked a question, which we might ask for clarification. Steve asks, why don't you have older water samples?
Ah,
Um,
so Babs or Barbara Wortham, she was really, and I want to think about this, but I'm confident that I can say this. She was the first in the US to actually try this. Their Europeans have been doing some work on this for probably a decade now. Some were having success, others were seeing complications. And so she was working with a colleague at Miami, a school of Rosenstiel School of uh, and it took a lot of work. In fact, at one point, they stole a carburetor from his BMW motorcycle and added it to the machine to kind of filter out some of the gunk, the organic acids that seemed to
hmm,
be messing the analyses. So I guess what I'm really trying to say, it took her 3 years of doing things like that, and rerunning and tweaking machines and, before started coming out that was really reproducible over and over again, and reproducible with using the same machines as the Europeans were using. Because if we can't reproduce these on other people's labs, then we don't know what we're measuring. So this is really the last 2 years that she was working on her dissertation. That's what it took to just even get the data that she had. And we are now setting up in my lab, well, in my department, where we hope to be doing this in-house soon. And hopefully now we're ready to do a lot more data. So we will have some from older and other people's stalagmites that will be older and younger.
excellent, which presages the next set of questions. It starts with a question from Vicky, who's asking, do you know if any of the caves in Texas if any of the caves in Texas are being researched for similar data? And that's followed by Brian Vaughter asking, for Jay, do we have similar work done on Texas speleothems? So yeah, let me just say, Brian Vaughter is the manager at Natural Bridge Caverns in New Braunfels. If you've never been there, that is an amazing cave. It's a north cave and a south cave. It's wild tours. It's just so many awesome caves in Texas. Natural Bridge, Inner Space Caverns, Cave Without a Name. Texas is an embarrassment of riches in terms of the hill country and the Edwards Plateau. Hundreds, not thousands, of caves. It's pretty remarkable for that. And so Brian is the manager at Natural Bridge, and he's asking, any similar work done on Texas speleothems? One, I wish. Two, as you know, we're doing actually a lot of work on Texas speleothems, but not yet this very exacting kind of analysis that Professor Montañez is describing. And maybe what we'll have to do is appeal to her and her recently graduated PhD student, Babs, who she keeps talking about, who's now doing a postdoctoral fellowship at Berkeley. And maybe the leverage we have is that Babs or Barbara is a native Texan, and she got her undergraduate degree in environmental science at the University of Texas at Austin. So maybe we could appeal to her roots to engage her in some of the research on the samples that we have from Natural Bridge and other caves in the region.
Exactly. And actually, Brian and Vicky, but Brian, I think we've met on a field trip that Jay ran through to Natural Bridges. I seem to think we've met, or maybe I've heard of you. And I was going to mention that certainly Babs, because I'm sure she interacted. Yes, no, and we would be happy. Like I said, I will know in the next 6 months or so, but I think we're just about set up, where we'll be running these in-house with a new hire who happens to be a water isotope person and who uses the kind of equipment that is necessary. So yeah, we're certainly enlisting Babs and her expertise and to continue to work with us on this. So we'd be happy to try samples.
Oh, that's exciting. And Brian is offering that he might know of some samples. So excellent.
Take them out of Jay's lab.
That's right. He knows just where they are. Yes. So Isabel, I wonder if you could share with our audience a little bit about things you do in terms of reconstructing past climate and what the Earth's surface was like much longer ago than these 10,000. This seems really long, but your work goes really into what we might call deep time.
You really want me to talk really deep? What he's referring to, it's true. I do very much love working speleothems, but I've probably most of my career has probably been more in looking at climate. Now we're talking hundreds of millions of years ago. And it's mostly, I think it's because I love being a forensic geochemist, you know, and the cave work is wonderful. And there are a lot of people working in them now. But there's a lot of challenges when you go deeper in time, and I like a good challenge. And so, and I like field work, right? I think that's why I've done so much in the deeper time. But I'll just give you an example of the kind of things we can do, because I think it's exciting what you can do these days in terms of observations and modeling. So we just published a study, for example, where we looked at novel isotopes in old marine deposits. And in this case, it was uranium isotopes. And because we have been using different archives to get at reconstructing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, we can do comparisons, right? What was CO2 in the atmosphere doing during periods which would undoubtedly be warming? And what was the ocean doing? And what we can show very clearly is that there was this abrupt warming, and CO2 driven, and that it led to anoxia in a quarter of the ocean floor. And it is a time that paleontologists have long known there have been major loss of life in the oceans and on land, big changes in forest migrations, and also loss of large numbers of forest plant types. And then we use climate models, the same climate models we use in the much more recent, the same ones they use to project the future, to try to understand, right? To contextualize those observations. And in this case, they could tell us very clearly that if you have that much CO2 rise, the models then end up losing ice in this case, the southern hemisphere, and that changes the fresh water on the surface of the southern oceans, and that cuts off deep water formation, and bang, it makes about 20 to 25% ocean anoxia. Is it right? You never know, right? But it says that that's one explanation for what we might be seeing. And again, in the future, we're already seeing loss of oxygen in ocean bodies, surface now, and coastal waters even down deeper. You know, it all kind of is expected. As you warm, that's what happens.
Fascinating. You could tell that much going that far back. Really is. Well, we have some more questions from our listeners. So Steve is asking, did the dripping stop during the Ice Age? Were things so evaporative that maybe it just didn't even rain anymore?
It's a really interesting question, Steve, and I'd be curious, Steve, who? Are you a student, or are you a researcher? But I will tell you, it's natural. It's a very, I sense you know quite a bit. And the reason I say that is that's sort of what we've been biased to think, is that everywhere in the Northern Hemisphere typically got drier during the last Ice Age. Certainly the Amazon went to be seasonally dry. It was no longer these ever wet forests of today. But it turns out, actually, for years or for decades, the records from the West, especially California, have not said that at all. They've actually said it might be wetter. And when you look at climate models, and we've been doing quite a bit of climate modeling, doesn't matter which model you use, and you do all kinds of changes on the parameters, it's wetter. It's actually wetter coming from the Pacific. The storms coming from the Pacific, wetter. They're coming further from the south, so they have an isotopic signature or character that's different. And I think we're seeing that in our records. It's wetter, and it's a shift in where the water's coming from. At least for the coast. Different probably when you're looking at waters coming from the Gulf or the Atlantic or elsewhere.
And so in some of these records, you can find periods where we can make a pretty strong inference that things were no longer dripping, right? Because you can date things and you could see that there's a big time gap and these things aren't growing during that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't, you're right. Thanks for prompting me. I didn't answer his question well. We do have time gaps. There are hiatuses. They're not where you expect them. So there are periods that go dry. Earlier in the last ice age, there's undoubtedly a period that goes dry. When you go further back, there are periods that go dry. Right before the Younger Dryas, there's a hiatus, it seems. And in California, about after 1,500 years ago, not much dripping. There's not a lot of formation, except at the higher altitude caves, because they have snow melt, that will be in, or snow that covers their surface above the cave, and then it melts. And that's a different process, right? It's a different system. But no, you can see that in the caves, absolutely. But it's not looking to be the cold times. It's, if anything, some of those are with the warm times, the stopping of dripping.
Yeah, yeah. But still, you guys date something to 20,000 years, like one of these formations, right? At the very bottom, it's 20,000. It was actively growing at the top. It's kind of mind blowing that for all the uncertainties we have, and forensics always has some uncertainties involved with it, as you're pointing out. Isn't it still just fascinating? There's some things that are kind of incontrovertible. That water had to have been dripping at that spot 20,000 years ago. I mean, it's just, to me, that we could make that connection is, that's why we do science.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that the system stayed pretty stable. Somebody asked, our rock person asked about earthquakes. Sometimes you could have a drip turn off because you just cut off the hydrology. Maybe you plug up the fracture through the rock above the cave, or maybe you have an earthquake that shifts the hydrology. That's possible. But usually, like you said, it's pretty darn cool. This thing has been pretty much a strip chart, or, like a EKG of water dripping at different rates for thousands of years.
It's quite a lifetime for that EKG. Absolutely. So Jewel D asks, would it be possible to find pockets of ancient water trapped in limestone rather than in caves?
So it's interesting. The guy that is setting up to do this in our department, to be able to do the analyses, actually wants to try all kinds of minerals. My scientific gut would say it will be harder pockets because of the way the crystals grow. Now, I should say right up front, we've seen little tiny inclusions of water in limestones for a long time. I mean, there's definitely seawater trapped in those limestones. It's just that probably not in enough amount that you could measure it isotopically, or it would be a challenge, a real challenge. And I think the reason in caves is that cave calcites, which are essentially limestones, but they form very quickly because it's a vadose environment, an air, water environment. And so when the drip water releases its carbon dioxide, those waters are saturated. I mean, they're like, think of water with sugar or salt dissolved in it, and you cool it, and the salt and the sugar just wants to fall out. And that's what's happening here. These crystals are growing vertically very fast, and they're closing up pretty fast. Limestones that you see elsewhere, they grew really slowly. So it'd be harder to trap the water too.
Right. Let's take a last question. It comes from Ms. Muniz, and she asks, what inspired you to pursue a career in science?
Well, it's literally, I wanted to be a vet, and then I couldn't stand blood, so that wasn't going to go too well. Blood from animals, not humans, that was okay, but not from animals. That was definitely a problem. I used to fossil collect with my dad. I mean, and he wasn't that he was a geologist or anything like that, but he's a scientist, and we'd go fossil collecting, and I just thought it was kind of like what you were talking about, Jay, we'd find trilobites, these ancient arthropods that don't look a whole lot different than, well, maybe not roaches, but what is it, horseshoe crabs today. And I just thought it was just unbelievable that these were 500 million years old. We knew that from just little fossil collector books. And I just got really engaged in science and ancient, like the old world, the fact that you could learn the history of the world before any humans were around. And that just one thing led to another. And then I became a geologist, and then I really fell in love with paleoclimatology.
Very cool. Isabel, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. This was awesome stuff. And I say that in a biased way. That was awesome stuff because I love it too. So thank you so much for your time. And if you'd like more information about Isabel and her research and her student who she's been talking about, Barbara Wortham, here are some places you can go, and an acknowledgement also at the end of where the support for such research comes from. Thanks once again, Isabel. Have a great night, everybody.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us.